open the vault, and $100 million are yours," joked the billionaire, his voice echoing through the marble hallway. But the poor young man pushing the cleaning cart didn't laugh. He just nodded politely, his eyes red from crying in the supply closet moments before, clutching a hospital bill he couldn't pay. Marcus Chen, 26 years old, had been working as a maintenance worker at the Hastings estate for only 3 weeks, barely making enough to cover rent in a cramped studio apartment across the city. And tonight, on the 6-month anniversary of his mother's death, the weight of her final medical bills he'd promised to pay to honor her, memory pressed against his chest like a stone, making it hard to breathe as he wiped down the gleaming banister that probably cost more than he'd earned in 5 years. The man who'd made the joke, 72-year-old billionaire William Hastings, stood in his silk robe and expensive slippers, holding a glass of whiskey, his silver hair perfectly combed even at 11 o'clock at night. And though his mansion sprawled across 40 rooms filled with priceless art and antiques, his eyes carried a loneliness that no amount of money seemed to cure, especially since his daughter hadn't called in 3 years, and his wife had passed a decade ago, leaving him in a palace that felt more like a mausoleum. "You know I'm serious, young man," William continued, his tone still playful, but with an edge of something else, perhaps testing, perhaps hoping for entertainment, perhaps just desperate for human connection. "That vault right there," he gestured toward the enormous steel door embedded in the wall of his private study, visible through the open doorway, "contains more money than you'll see in 10 lifetimes, 100 million in cash, bonds, and gold bars, and all you'd need to do is figure out the combination." Marcus paused in his cleaning, not because he was tempted, but because he recognized something in the old man's voice, the same hollowness his mother had when she talked about Marcus's father leaving them when Marcus was 5. That specific kind of pain that comes from having everything except what you actually need. "I'm sure it's very secure, Mr. Hastings," Marcus replied softly, returning to his work, his hands trembling slightly as he sprayed cleaner on the ornate mirror. And William noticed the trembling, noticed the redness in the young man's eyes, noticed the way his uniform was clean but worn, the shoes resoled multiple times, the watch on his wrist that had stopped working, but he still wore it. William had built his fortune by noticing details others missed. "You're not even curious?" William pressed, stepping closer, studying Marcus with the intensity of someone solving a puzzle. "Most people, when I make that joke, their eyes light up, they laugh, they play along, they ask questions. But you look like I just told you the world's saddest story." Marcus's throat tightened, because in a way, that's exactly what it was. Sad story about having so much, and still needing to joke with the help at 11 o'clock at night, because there's no one else to talk to, and he understood that kind of loneliness, had felt it every day since his mother's hospital bed went silent, since the nurses turned off the machines, since he'd packed up her small apartment by himself because there was no one else, no siblings, no father, just him and memories and bills he couldn't pay. "I'm just tired, sir," Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly, despite his best effort to keep it professional. "It's been a long day." William's expression softened, and he did something he hadn't done in years. He really looked at another person, not as an employee, or a business contact, or a servant, but as a human being carrying weight, and what he saw shook something loose inside him, some calcified piece of his heart that had hardened over decades of acquisitions and victories and losses that money couldn't fix. "What's your name?" William asked, even though he'd been told 3 weeks ago and had forgotten immediately, the way he forgot all their names. "Marcus, Sir Marcus Chen." "Marcus," William repeated, tasting the name, making it real. "Why are your eyes red, Marcus?" The question was so direct, so unexpectedly personal, that Marcus's carefully constructed professional walls crumbled, and before he could stop himself, the truth spilled out. Today's the 6-month anniversary of my mother's death, and I got another call from the collection agency about her medical bills, and I promised her as she was dying that I'd pay every penny, that I wouldn't let her leave this world in debt. But I'm drowning, Mr. Hastings. I'm working 3 jobs, and I'm still drowning. And some days I'm so tired I can barely see straight. But I can't stop because a promise to your dying mother is sacred, and I don't know what to do anymore. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway that cost more than Marcus's mother's entire medical care. And William felt something he hadn't felt in decades, shame, deep and burning, at the realization that he'd been joking about money, flaunting it, while this young man was being crushed by the very thing. William had so much of that he kept $100 million in a vault just because he could. How much do you owe? William asked quietly. $247,000, sir, Marcus whispered, the number a monster that haunted his dreams. That's all, William said before he could stop himself, and Marcus flinched because of course it was nothing to a billionaire, but it was everything to him, and William saw the flinch and hated himself for it. I'm sorry that came out wrong, I meant, but Marcus was already gathering his cleaning supplies, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger and shame. I should finish my work, sir, Marcus said, his voice tight, professional walls slamming back up. And he moved to the next room, but William followed him. Whiskey forgotten on the banister, something urgent rising in his chest. Wait, please. I didn't mean to diminish your struggle. I'm an old fool who's forgotten what real problems are, William said, and the raw honesty in his voice made Marcus stop. Marcus, let me pay it. Let me pay your mother's debt. It would mean nothing to me financially, but everything to you. Marcus turned. And William expected gratitude, expected tears of joy, but instead saw something that shocked him: fierce, quiet dignity. No, thank you, Mr. Hastings, Marcus said firmly. I appreciate the offer more than you know, but I made a promise, and it only means something if I keep it myself, if you pay it. I'm just another charity case, another poor person saved by a rich man's guilt. But if I pay it, even if it takes me years, then I've honored her memory with my own hands, my own sacrifice, and that's worth more than money. William stood frozen, stunned, because in his 72 years of buying and selling and negotiating and winning, no one had ever refused his money for reasons that had nothing to do with pride or manipulation or playing hard to get. Marcus's refusal was pure, born from love and integrity, and William realized he was standing in front of something he'd spent his entire fortune trying to find: genuine goodness, uncorrupted by wealth or status or greed. Your mother raised an extraordinary man, William said, his voice thick with emotion he didn't bother hiding. Tell me about her. And so Marcus did, standing in that hallway at nearly midnight, while his cleaning cart sat forgotten. He told William about Lin Chen, who'd immigrated from Taiwan with nothing, who'd worked in restaurant kitchens for 30 years, who'd saved every penny to make sure Marcus could go to community college, who'd loved him with a fierceness that made up for his father's absence, who'd taught him that character is what you do when no one's watching, who'd faced cancer with such grace and courage that the nurses cried when she died, who'd apologized in her final breath for leaving him with debt. And Marcus had held her hand and promised it didn't matter. He'd take care of everything. She could rest now. William listened with tears streaming down his face, unashamed, because Marcus's story was cracking open something in him that had been locked away since his own wife died, since his daughter left, since he'd replaced human connection with acquisition and comfort with control. I had a daughter, William found himself saying, words he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Emily, she's 38 now, lives in Seattle, hasn't spoken to me in 3 years because I missed her wedding to close a business deal. And before that, I missed her college graduation for a merger. And before that, I missed most of her childhood for meetings and negotiations and building an empire she never asked for. Marcus listened, really listened, the way his mother had taught him to listen, not waiting to speak, but hearing the pain beneath the words. When my wife died, Emily begged me to slow down, to spend time with her, to be her father instead of a financial titan. But I didn't know how I'd forgotten how to be a person. Marcus, I'd become a transaction machine. And eventually she stopped calling, stopped trying. And now I live in this massive house with 40 rooms, and I can't remember the last time someone touched me with affection, or asked how I really am, or cared about anything other than my money. The two men stood in the hallway, billionaire and maintenance worker, and the distance between them, the vast canyon of wealth and status and privilege, somehow collapsed into nothing. Because grief is grief, and loneliness is loneliness, and the human heart doesn't care about tax brackets. It's not too late, Marcus said gently. My mother used to say that as long as you're breathing, you can choose differently. I wouldn't even know where to start, William admitted. I've been this person for so long. Start with the truth, Marcus suggested, echoing his mother's advice. Call your daughter and tell her what you just told me, that you were wrong, that you're sorry, that you miss her. People can forgive almost anything if you're genuinely sorry. Over the following weeks, something remarkable happened. William asked Marcus to come earlier in the evenings, not to clean, but to talk, and Marcus agreed, because he recognized a drowning man when he saw one, and his mother had taught him to throw life preservers, not judgments. They talked for hours, sitting in the study near the famous vault, about life, and death, and meaning, and regret. And William learned that Marcus had studied engineering in community college, but had to drop out when his mother got sick. And Marcus learned that William had wanted to be a teacher once, but his own father had pushed him into business. And they discovered that both of them were living lives shaped by promises and expectations, and love that sometimes helped and sometimes hurt. William started calling Emily, leaving voicemails at first awkward, halting messages where he apologized and meant it. Marcus started taking online classes again, with William insisting on paying the tuition as an investment, not charity. Because I believe you'll do something important with that engineering degree. Slowly, painfully, like bones healing after a break. Both men began to transform. William started donating, not just money, but time, volunteering at hospice centers, where his presence and listening brought comfort, where he held the hands of dying strangers and learned what his wife's final days might have been like if he'd been present instead of at the office. And Marcus began to see that accepting help wasn't weakness if it was offered from genuine care rather than pity or obligation. Then came the night, 3 months after their first real conversation, when William called Marcus into the study with unusual formality, and Marcus worried he'd overstepped, gotten too comfortable, forgotten his place. But William's face was radiant with something Marcus had never seen there, pure, uncomplicated joy. She answered, William said, his voice breaking. Emily answered my call, and we talked for 2 hours. Marcus, to ours end. She's still angry, and we have so much to work through. But she's willing to try. She's coming to visit next month, and I have you to thank for that. Marcus shook his head. I didn't do anything. Mr. Hastings, you did the work. You reminded me how to be human, William said. You showed me that integrity and love and keeping promises matter more than empires and vaults and all the money I've hoarded thinking it would protect me from pain. He walked to the vault, that massive steel door that started this whole journey, and for the first time in Marcus's presence, he opened it, revealing stacks of bills and bearer bonds and gold bars that glittered in the lamplight like dragon's treasure. And Marcus felt nothing, no desire, no envy, just a mild curiosity, because the vault that had seemed so important was just metal and paper, and the real treasure had been the friendship they'd built. I'm changing my will, William said. Most of this is going to causes that matter: medical debt forgiveness, hospice care, scholarships for students who have to drop out to care for sick parents, and I'm setting up a foundation for Emily to run if she wants, so she can use this wealth to heal things instead of just accumulating more." "That's beautiful, sir," Marcus said, "and I'm paying off your mother's debt," William added quickly, raising his hand before Marcus could protest. "Not as charity, not as a gift, but as payment too gave me back my daughter. Marcus, you gave me back my humanity, and no consultant or therapist or business advisor could have done that. So consider it a fair trade, your wisdom and friendship in exchange for clearing a debt that should never have existed in the first place, because no one should die and leave their child drowning in bills for the crime of trying to save their life." Marcus's eyes filled with tears because when William framed it that way, not as rescue but as exchange, not as pity but as recognition of value given, his pride could accept it, and the weight he'd been carrying for 6 months, the crushing pressure that made it hard to breathe, suddenly lifted, and he could inhale fully for the first time since his mother's funeral. "Thank you," Marcus whispered. "Thank you for seeing me as a person, not a charity case." "Thank you," William replied, "for seeing me as a person, not a bank account." The night that Emily came to visit, William asked if Marcus would join them for dinner, and Marcus initially refused, not wanting to intrude on their reconciliation. But Emily herself called him and said, "My father told me everything you did for him. Please come. I want to meet the person who gave me back my dad." And so Marcus sat at that enormous dining table, no longer a maintenance worker, but a friend. And he watched William and Emily navigate their complicated love with honesty and tears and laughter. And he felt his mother's presence so strongly, felt her approval, knew she would be proud of the man he was becoming, the kindness he was choosing even when life had been cruel. In the months that followed, Marcus finished his engineering degree with honors, got a job at a firm designing sustainable housing for low-income communities, and continued having dinner with William every Sunday, a tradition that fed them both more than any food could. William sold his mansion, moved into a smaller home, gave the rest to the foundation, and spent his remaining years, 5 beautiful years, volunteering, rebuilding his relationship with Emily, and becoming a grandfather to her twins, present for every birthday and school play and scraped knee, finally learning that wealth isn't measured in vaults, but in moments of connection. On the day William died peacefully in his sleep at 7, surrounded by Emily and her family, Marcus was there too, holding the old man's hand the way he'd held his mother's. And William's final words were, "I'm glad I met you. Son, you saved my life." And Marcus whispered back, "You saved mine too." At the funeral, Emily asked Marcus to speak, and he stood before the gathered crowd, not the massive crowd William's wealth might have drawn in his earlier life, but a smaller gathering of people he'd actually touched, actually loved, actually known. And, Marcus said, "William Hastings once joked about a vault containing $100 million, and for most of his life, he thought that vault was the most valuable thing he owned, but in his final years, he discovered that the real treasure was never in the steel and gold, it was in the courage to be vulnerable, the humility to admit mistakes, the love he rebuilt with his daughter, the friendships he made when he stopped buying relationships and started earning them, and the peace that comes from knowing that when you die, people will cry because they miss you, not because they miss your money." Years later, Marcus established his own foundation, focused on eliminating medical debt for families who'd lost loved ones to illness. And he funded it not just with the money William left him in the will, a generous but not excessive amount, enough to honor their friendship without making Marcus dependent, but with his own work, his own innovation, his own hands building the legacy his mother and his mentor had taught him mattered. And every person whose debt he forgave received a letter that said, "This is paid in honor of Lin Chen and William Hastings, who taught us that the measure of a life is not what you accumulate, but what you give, not what you own, but who you love, and that the only vault worth opening is the one around your own heart, because that's where the real treasure lives, in our capacity for kindness, for connection, for choosing love over fear, and generosity over greed, for keeping our promises to the dying and giving second chances to the living, for seeing each other not as rich or poor, powerful or weak, but as fellow travelers on this brief, beautiful, painful journey, all of us seeking the same thing in the end, to matter, to be loved, to leave the world slightly better than we found it, and to know that when our own final breath comes, we lived with open hands and open hearts, giving freely of the only currency that survives us, the love we shared and the lives we touched.